Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this meeting is being hosted on the traditional lands of the Bindal peoples, and I pay my respect to elders, both past and present. Our expectation is that the interactions during seminars are constructive and that all attendees behave with respect and consideration for others. I will now pass you on to Professor Tiffany Morrison, who's introducing our speaker this afternoon.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Morrison. I co-lead the People and Ecosystems program in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon Dr. Guy Jackson. I met Guy at the beginning of last year, just before the world closed down in Townsville. He curiously had just emerged from a PhD at the University of Queensland in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and was being employed as a postdoc at Lund University in Sweden, but based in Northern Australia. So Guy's background is in, or his PhD was on the influence of emergency food aid on the root causes of disaster vulnerability in Indigenous food systems in Papua New Guinea. And in the last year, he has spent a fair amount of time doing, mostly I understand, ethnographic approach in Northern Australia to understand how we can better understand climate loss and damage from a non-economic perspective, doing interviews in Darwin, Cairns and Townsville. So I think this afternoon's talk will be interesting to all of us, not just as scholars, but also as citizens of Northern Australia. So thanks, Guy.
Thanks so much, Tiffany, for that. And thanks everyone for coming and for giving me the opportunity to speak. So yeah, I've got a disaster background, so disaster research background, and while I was doing my PhD, I did some work on loss and damage. I did a review and a few other sort of little case studies here, and just so happened that a postdoc came up that with loss and damage focused. So it's on the recasting the disproportionate impacts of climate change extremes, and it's referred to as DICE, and that's a FORMUS, so Swedish Research Council funded project. We've got quite a decent team full of like professors, postdocs and PhDs, and we're all sort of doing our thing in different countries. And because of COVID, I decided to stay in Australia. My background with Pacific, so PNG and Vanuatu. And yeah, so I was one of the rare ones who actually could keep doing fieldwork when COVID was happening, and which I'm really lucky about that. My team's slowly getting around to doing their fieldwork now. Basically, we're really trying to explore non-economic loss and damage, but beyond that, with a focus on extreme events, but beyond that, we are interested in economic dimensions too, and separating the two is very difficult. So often, you know, things have an economic dimension and then things have a non-economic value as well, and it's quite blurred, and a real theme of this research is that we're really critiquing the concept of loss and damage. So it's not just taking it as a given. We're actually currently working on a paper looking at the governmentalities of loss and damage and sort of the rationalities that led to its creation, the political process, sort of object creation, bargaining, those sorts of things. So yeah, we are taking a very critical lens, but really underlying everything we're doing though is a climate justice perspective. So I've got like a short slideshow that I'll go through just to give a background on loss and damage, and then basically it will just be me talking about my fieldwork. And this research it's sort of wrapped up the qualitative research side of things, but I'm still thinking through and going through the data. So it's sort of a work in progress, although there's a few manuscripts that will soon to be submitted. I'll just share the screen. So okay, back. Let me know if anyone has issues seeing that. So the title, I was just trying to think of a title. I'm particularly interested in vulnerability and unequal, like differential vulnerability and the root causes. So my thesis was looking at the root causes of vulnerability, and that sort of comes with me, I suppose, in this. But this title comes from a paper that I've almost got ready. So I thought I'd go through this and then discuss some other things. So we'll talk about vulnerability, and I'll talk about vulnerability and talk about some other aspects. But this really, I wanted to just give you an overview of the things that I learned talking to people throughout Australia. So I've spoken to about 200 people formally, and then just had loads of conversations. And I've been sort of with environmental centers and with First Nations people, just been sort of like with them and interacting with them. Like, so a lot of the research was, it's not always about climate change, but there was some more, like, so the 200 people that I suppose was more targeted and were actually speaking about climate change, loss and damage, whereas there's a lot of messy ethnographic work where it's just conversations about important, like, things that are important to different stakeholder groups, whether that's like protecting the environment, or whether that's sovereignty and agency in First Nations groups like in Yarrabah and stuff. So this will be more distilled, and then there'll be some more contextual stuff that will come into it. Just a little bit of an overview. What is loss and damage? Yeah, so loss and damage it's a term that's been used for a long time in disaster research. So like losses and damages, like a sort of a more economic framing, like what was, you know, a drought causes such and such losses to, you know, farming production. That was how it was termed for quite a while. And then it was actually, what this concept didn't come from like a paper written by academics. It was actually driven by the Alliance of Small Island States. They were in relation to inevitable sea level rise in 1991. So it was entered in, there was a proposal given by the Alliance of Small Island States in 1991. And then it sort of got bounced around, and it sort of entered the UNFCCC process here and there. And then it eventually became established as the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage in 2013. And it had a developing country focus. And that's really from the advocacy. It was framed as those who least contributed to climate change are those that are going to be most affected. So higher vulnerability, lower adaptive capacity, less resources. So that's how it's been framed in the international, I suppose, international climate governance space. And I suppose you can read that anyway, but it's like, to address loss and damage associated with impacts of climate change, including extreme events and slow onset events in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. And then the WIM specifically is its whole purpose is averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with climate change impacts, including extreme weather events and slow onset events. And then it was enshrined in the Paris Agreement as Article 8. And with it's quite a technocratic focus, which I'll critique later, but looking at early warning systems, emergency preparation, slow onset events, comprehensive risk assessment, management, risk insurance, non-economic losses. And then there's various, they're trying to get the Santiago network, which is really focused on technology transfer and, you know, funding from the developed world to the developing world. So that's the international policy, but there's actually, what we're interested in this project is the science of loss and damage. And science is, you know, the quality, it could be any epistemological approach you want to take, but really broadly the science of loss and damage. There on the left there's which you probably all, you know, read, the AR6 report looking at like what's likely, what's actually happening with extreme events. This project has an extreme event focus, but like, as I will talk about in the Australia case studies, that's not how often people view climate change in Australia, because we're so normalized. Disasters are so normalized, particularly in Northern Australia. It might not be the best approach. And so I argue that in one of my upcoming papers. However, we are looking at extreme events, but I'm interested in beyond that. And it's the slow onset processes that are really interesting from an academic standpoint, but the extreme events do appear to make climate change more visible, where some of the more insidious slow effects can be imperceptible, particularly when people don't have a good ecological understanding. Like they can't even notice changes sometimes until it's gone. So there's some of the things. Some of the key themes we're looking at, so economic versus non-economic loss and damage. Just to define first, so loss is irreparable, it's like permanent. And damage is repairable, right? That's just a simple way of thinking it. It's more nuanced than that, and you can critique those approaches too, because sometimes what can be perceived as a loss, if you looked at it more critically, might not actually be a loss. Yeah, but we won't get too caught up on that. What's become really important over the last decade, and scholarship only really started, it caught up with the process after the WIM was introduced in 2013, then scholars started looking at loss and damage. So the review we did in 2019 on why is climate change we really saw there was an explosion after the WIM was created. So the first paper we found was like 2010 and then 2013. And then from on, it's become quite a large literature. We're about 250 studies now, I think, the last time we checked. And in the last 10 years, and then it has been sort of become part of loss and damage, is the extreme event attribution, which sort of looks at how likely that a particular event was, what was the percentage that climate change may have contributed to an extreme event. And there's like 4 different types. There's philosophical, like, well, climate change is a real thing. And so everything is, climate change. We live in a climate change world. And then there's the more sort of risk and statistical analysis to really pinpoint it. And that's become really important for the loss and damage debate. There's currently a global stocktake in the UNFCCC, and there's one on loss and damage too. My team did an empirical, well, I suppose, statistic, looking at actually data sets around the world, looking at what loss and damage is. And the problem is a lot of the loss and damage aren't recorded. So it's useful because, MDAT database, which is a disaster database, they only record things over a certain threshold, like 10 people die and such economic cost, and then it gets recorded in the database. But at the moment, and we're really contributing to this, so global stocktake. So what are the impacts, who is affected, and what scale? But I proposed the science of loss back in 2016, and that was quite influential. And it's really like a socially engaged science of loss. And it's all about meanings, like perceptions. The reason why I chose perceptions and experiences, because we can look at something as an objective truth, and we can use science, but really, like, how people perceive the world is mediated by their life experience, by their culture, by their religion, by their exposure to science, and by their trust in government and institutions. And so in Australia, as we've seen, you might say there's been some, I hate to say this, like, quite shallow, you get those like yearly updates about how concerned people are in Australia about climate change, but it doesn't really explain that much. Like, someone can be concerned, but how do they actually interpret climate change? And like, what does it actually mean to them? And what are they willing to do to, change it, and how much? So this project using ethnographic methods is really trying to bring color to those sort of statements, like concerned about climate change, or, and then see what comes next. So it's important to record the losses and damages that are occurring, but really what comes next and what does it mean? And because of that, it's very messy and very difficult to do. So, and nothing's, even though I have quite a large collection of interviews and things like that, I don't proclaim to know everything about everyone. I just try to capture a range of perspectives, and one thing led to another, and it was very sort of, I would interview the Financial Council of Australia, then I got invited to do a plenary conference talk on climate change vulnerability, and then that led to hundreds of discussions with financial counsellors who work with, marginalised and vulnerable people. And then, then I went to the First Nation, the National First Peoples Gathering on Climate Change in Cairns, and then that led to a relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So one thing led to another, and it got quite messy, but it's been quite rich and very interesting for me, being an insider-outsider. So a citizen of Australia, grew up in Adelaide, outsider of North Queensland, but still, grew up enculturated into Australian society, which is different than my previous research, being sort of from an ethic perspective. So, but I'm an insider outsider, and it's all messy and everything else. So some positionality there, and plus, white male, early 30s, from a working class background, which helps in certain circumstances, but feels sort of an outcast in some academic circles at times. So it's like I am just a constant insider outsider in my life, which helps and also problematizes my research. Climate justice compensation. So I'll stop talking about the international context, but the big debate in loss and damage was that developing countries, particularly small islands, wanted compensation. Some would argue reparations for the losses that they're experiencing and will experience in the future. And Annex 1 countries, so Australia, Europe, US, were very hesitant to ever talk about that. So it became compensation, compensation, litigation, those sorts of things were taken out of the Paris Agreement to get it through. However, there was a clause saying that anything in the future might be open. And so compensation is a big theme in the literature. And so the governmentalities of loss and damage paper, we got it, the agreement to submit that to Progress in Environmental Geography, which is a new journal with an amazing editorial team. So I'll look out for that. Look out for that later. Here's just a little overview. So human life, sense of place, cultural heritage, biodiversity, ecosystems, identity, social, emotional well-being, communal sites, production sites, ecosystem services, agency, health, livelihoods, infrastructure, physical assets, etc. You can, however people perceive the world is, and however what they value, they could potentially lose, right? So it's about the sort of subjective view of the world and that people experience and what they value to actually, because one loss for one person wouldn't mean a loss for another person, right? And I'll draw on some case study experiences of that. And that's from an upcoming paper in One Earth that comes out tomorrow. So we just gave an overview. And this is from Emily Boyd, my colleague and boss, papers they did. So these are different framings of loss and damage, where it's adaptation, mitigation, that sort of like within L&D can be dealt with through existing emergency management frameworks and other things, development broadly. Risk management, which is a dominant one, where they recognize that climate change is a different risk, but it can still be dealt with through climate risk management, or they call it comprehensive risk management. And then there's limits to adaptation, which is in the academic literature is the more dominant framing, which is like there is limits, social and physical limits to adaptation. And so loss and damage is beyond that. I'll debate and critique that later. And then existential in the top here, which is really like, you know, climate change is an existential threat. And particularly from a climate justice angle, it's about that differential vulnerability and about liability, like who's common but differentiated responsibility. That's the, you know, one of the guiding principles of the UNFCCC process. And so that's that framing. And that was in the review we did back in 2019. The most dominant ones in the academic were limits to adaptation, risk management, and existential was coming up third. Not too many people thought it could be dealt with existing disaster sort of management approaches, but that's basically just because we, you know, like we've improved a lot over the years, but there's still many issues with that. Here's just so this is just a conceptualization of beyond adaptation. And there's also, you'll see this as well, like tolerable risk, intolerable risk and adaptation, avoidable, unavoidable impacts and stuff like that. Important to keep in mind, there's hard and soft limits, socially constructed vulnerability. So it's the actions of humans and the way we interact with the world. But there is certain thresholds, so there's physical limits. And of course, your coral reef research has shown that there are physical limits, of course. And then on top of that, tipping points and cascading hazards. Okay, so here's just some photographs. I'll just, from my fieldwork, that's me plugging papers at the end to make you all read them. And yeah, so I've had a really good relationship with Jungan people up in Cairns, around the Cairns region. They were forcibly taken off their land and massacred and all that history put into Yarrabah. And so I've been working with Yarrabah a lot. On the right there is the Cairns Far North Environmental Centre. So I went along and been helping with them, and that was in Machin's Beach with the community there. And then on the bottom left, that's up in the Tablelands, where they had a big environmental roundtable, which I helped and volunteered and spoke to loads of people about climate change. And on the right there, that's just with some local Yidinji people during the first peaceful gathering. I'll just stop sharing, and then you can, because I'll sort of just talk now and about the project. So Northern Australia is a very diverse place, climatically, socially, culturally, like very difficult, and sort of, you know, these sort of sub-regions never represent reality perfectly. For example, there might be something more in common between, say, a remote Aboriginal community in Arnhem Land and in Cape York, but then Cairns is very different to Townsville, and Townsville is very different to Darwin, right? So it's Northern Australia is used just to explore, but and even though focusing on Townsville, Cairns and Darwin, I spoke to lots of people from other areas and people working in other areas. So I did sort of draw on perspectives from people who are working in the climate adaptation space, disaster risk, emergency managers. So I spoke to, you know, all the QFES people in Townsville, the northern region and far northern region, and in Darwin, the top end. So there was some sort of similarities between the people I approached. However, I spoke with environmentalists, I spoke with farmers, I spoke with business owners, I spoke with just sort of, there was a focus on disproportionate vulnerability. So I sort of sought out and tried to speak with people who might, from the outside at least, look disproportionately vulnerable. Some of those were fruitful, some of them are hard. It's difficult to engage with sort of people on the outskirts generally, but luckily I got to get their perspective too. But if one big observation is that in the climate change space, in the disaster space, it's very monotonal, to put it nicely. Environmental groups and you know, they're normally people who have the time and the energy to be concerned about things. So there's a few biases in the data set that I got, which I sort of, you know, openly discuss and we'll talk about. Broadly, how do people view climate change, loss and damage? Well, first things first, no one's heard of climate change, loss and damage, except for a few people. And the few people that knew about it learned about it recently at university. And they normally associate it with compensation and litigation, so climate litigation. I spoke with the Environmental Defenders Office and various other groups around in Townsville, in Cairns and in Darwin and nationally too. So that's how they often framed it. People generally do not associate climate change, loss and damage from extreme events. So, you know, being in North Queensland, we all know that we call them here falsely natural disasters because disaster risk is created from society, but natural disasters, how local people call them, are very normalized here. Slow onset, so cyclones, even amongst academics, not so much, no one particularly drew on attribution science except for a few people. And so that's another interesting point. So the science, but the media is very important. So a lot of people attributed climate change, loss and damage when I would explain what it sort of meant to the bushfires down south, but then they wouldn't attribute it to the bushfires in Queensland in 2018, although there has been attribution studies that link that by Lewis, is it the first name? Anyway, Lewis, she's now in politics, I think, from ANU, did some attribution studies on that, but local people didn't attribute that. So it's interesting how people, the science, but the media is very influential, right? So if the media attributed climate change more often, and then it depends on what media source they got it from. So people who, you know, listen to ABC or watch ABC, and because of that sort of focus on climate change in the bushfires, they will think that that was like a climate change loss and damage. But then on other things, they wouldn't express that, which just goes to show that those socio-political, socio-cultural determinations, like the backgrounds of people really, and how their circles they move in. And there's extremes on both ends. Like there was some environmentalists, like who I spoke to, who would attribute everything to climate change, right? Like every flood, every sort of heat wave, everything else they would attribute to climate change. And on the other end, there was, you know, the people, there was natural variability argument, and these sorts of things have been discussed in the literature quite a bit. So that's nothing new there. But the sort of, when you get into the nuances, even people that don't attribute climate change, loss and damage now are experiencing loss and grief, climate anxiety and things like that, and predicted to happen in the future. And then there's communities that are very, very exposed. So like the Northern Beaches in Cairns, people in Townsville, right? Like I spoke to lots of people about the flood in Townsville. Funnily enough, not many people that I spoke to at least attributed climate change to that. But then experts who I spoke to showed that increased risk of flooding, you know, extreme precipitation events in narrow bands of time. Like that's one of the big things that people are witnessing. But when I spoke to people in Townsville, they didn't necessarily attribute that to climate change. It's a very complex, sort of messy, subjective way of viewing the world, and really, really, really interesting when you start to talk to people. When someone doesn't perceive climate change as being a thing, or they think that climate change is happening, but it's only sea level rise, or slight, you know, changes of the average weather over a period of time, and yet they're infected by an extreme event, they still experience loss, loss and damage, but they might not perceive it as such. So you can take a step back and say, well, these people actually experience loss and damage from extreme events, but they don't believe it. And that's a really interesting thing to explore. And then there's people, the one group of people that always seem to be up to date, or not up to date, but were less unsure or anything else, was people who live like Aboriginal people in Yarrabah, for example. Now that's not 100% true, because like some people are so on the margins there that they're not really engaged. Like they've over-policed they're struggling with housing, they've got real chronic issues that they're trying to deal with. And this is the same in the NT and the same in Townsville with Palm Island. So I spoke with people there. So that's not to say, but when you speak to people who are engaging in politics, in sovereignty movements and things like that, they recognize climate change. And they actually see climate change as an opportunity in some regards to leverage the concern that is being shared by Australia. Not everyone in Australia, but collectively people are concerned about climate change. That's one thing that came through. Now, how they interpreted that was very various, but they are concerned. And that goes to that literature which says people in Australia are concerned. I can safely say, at least from my research, that people are generally concerned. And there's not that many, even some of the farmers I spoke to, they might not believe in climate change and they might call it natural variability, but they're concerned about the environment because that's where their livelihood comes from. So that level of concern is true. And yet the Yarrabah and also Palm Island and others in Townsville, the Googabardin peoples, they are experiencing significant loss and damage, but they won't foreground climate change because they will foreground the historical losses from colonization, and which is the ongoing sort of violence, state violence and non-state violence against their people. So that's another nuanced thing. It's about priorities. So if you think about climate change loss and damage, people might be devastated about the heat wave in Cairns in 2018 that killed a third of the spectral flying foxes. Speak to other people, they hate flying foxes, they see them as pests, but they were concerned by the heat wave, right? Because that was 2 days above 45, I think 40 something. They recorded, I spoke to the council, I think they recorded 47, which for Cairns is very rare, but dogs died and hospital admissions went up and people were terrified and people who didn't have air conditioning was disproportionately affecting. In the NT, water security and heat are the two things that people attributed to climate change. And to the point where they were concerned about the viability of the NT, like places like Tennant Creek, places like Catherine, and places like Darwin even itself. So people, the discussion in Darwin's a hot place, and this is where it comes back to perceptions. Some people I spoke to will be like, it's a badge of honor. It's like, oh, Darwin's always hot, go in Troppo, the build up. And then there's other people who are like, no, it's getting much hotter. We're really concerned. We're having problems with labor retention. So for them, some of those stakeholders, particularly social service people who work with people who are heightened vulnerability, say marginalized Aboriginal people, particularly in Darwin. Housing, people who work in housing are starting to recognize climate change as a significant, if not the most significant threat to them. So climate change plays this really interesting role. And there is a sort of a nascent movement of people wanting to engage in this space. They might not understand what climate change loss and damage is, but they understand climate change adaptation, and they recognize the need to try and limit the impact of climate change. And then that means when I was talking to people, asking people for interviews and such, they would often ask me to give back and do a seminar or some other way to try and understand. So there's a lot of institutions in Australia that are starting to grapple with these questions, whether it's like, Department of Housing in Queensland, whether it's, financial counsellors, the people who I was working with, and they really got involved in the bushfire response down south, whether it's environmental groups are really trying to, their primary goal is to preserve the environment, right? But they're starting to see that intersectionality between climate change and vulnerability and all these other things. So there's a lot happening. But the reality is like not enough. So loss and damage is occurring. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, like I thought I wouldn't, because that's your area, but the way people perceive the loss of the reef or the damage of the reef, it is recovering slightly, but for how long? Like as the literature suggests, and if you look at like long-term periods. And when I spoke to AIMS in Townsville, we had a roundtable with the management there and some of the scientists. They asked me a really pertinent question, which has actually something I was thinking about. They framed it away. What is the level of acceptable and unacceptable loss? So this is the idea of what comes next. So the idea is like losses and damages definitely happening. People perceive in vastly different ways. For one person, the loss of the reef has no bearing in their life because they just want a job, they want a family, they want the creature comforts. But what is the level of unacceptable and acceptable loss in Australia? And considering we're such a high emitting country on an individual level, but as an economy as a whole, like what will it take? And it seems like people are willing to acknowledge that there are losses and damages occurring from climate change. But what comes next? Well, mostly on the very sort of coping and incremental level. So it's like talking with communities that are highly exposed to coastal hazards. What do they want to do? And this is in their words, like me not saying like, these are the options, what do you take? They're like, try not make this funny or condescending in any way, because this is a massive question and it's not really their responsibility to deal with it. And that's another dimension of this research too, about like federal, state level governance, local governments. But people feel overwhelmed, like, Machen Speaks has a seawall they built by themselves. And then when I ask them, what do you do to prevent, the inevitable sea level rise and storm surge that comes with the next big cyclone? Well, they'll at first be like, well, the cyclone hasn't hit Cairns, so there must be some barrier around Cairns. And then you look at the historical literature, like, not at JCU in Cairns has done a lot of research on that, on the sort of geological history of Cairns in North Queensland. And, big cyclones come, and they come, more frequently than people think, and they say they're actually in a lull period historically, but they'll say like, oh, we'll build a seawall, or we'll replant some mangroves, which is all good things, right? So nature-based solutions seem to be like that to reduce risk of loss and damage, say from coastal hazards, is foreground, and that's all great. But people it's like they accept the fact that this is epochal changing the climate change, right? But they don't know what to do. They feel stuck. I was talking to a climate change consultant who works with Hinchinbrook Mayor, and he was saying that he doesn't know if his community will survive because they're so exposed on that river there and the coast. And so people are at the stage where they want action for climate change. They will be willing to buy an electric car, that they want to, reduce vulnerability in their community, and they're starting to recognize that they're disproportionate vulnerability. And most people would frame that as an Aboriginal issue, when I would argue that that's a political economic issue, and that they are disproportionately marginalized. But there's many people who are sort of on the margins in neoliberal Australia, right? So, but people are having those conversations, but they don't know what comes next. And local councils, state governments. I spoke with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and they treat it through an emergency management lens. Like they go, well, flood risk, so we have flood mapping and we won't build in certain areas, but they don't know really how to deal with like the loss of species or the loss of ecosystems. And these are the cultural values that people associate to things that are and will increasingly be impacted by climate change. So these are the questions that this research is really trying to deal with. And it does come down to an idea of disproportionality. I was being facetious and saying that the impacts in Australia, being highly exposed and vulnerable to extreme events particularly, are almost proportionate to, if not under proportionate to the amount of carbon dioxide as on a per capita basis that we emit into the atmosphere. So these are other questions too. Like there's different scenarios that might happen from loss and damage. Some areas might become sacrifice zones. So there's already talk in the NT about the viability of certain settlements, and this interacts with the homeland movement, which is Aboriginal people wanting to go back to their customary lands, but needing services because they're social determinants of health. Right? So these are fundamental and massive questions that we're not quite ready to deal with yet, but there is the growing acknowledgement that it exists. And particularly when it comes to cultural values, like it's a thing like what makes a place, like the space and place, like where people live, and how that links to people's identities. So in Cairns, for example, people were born here. It's a poor cane growing area, and it's become a tourism sort of mecca in the 80s, starting Japanese tourists and, other things from the 90s and 2000s, but it's traditionally a poor place. One person said, I asked them, what's the difference between Cairns and Townsville? It's like, oh, Cairns is used to being poor. And because, Townsville was more industrial center with the, pastoral industry and mining and stuff, or fly in, fly out stuff. But so, what makes a place? And people move to Cairns because they appreciate the reef and they appreciate the mountains, the wet tropics. So for someone who's deeply aware and connected to a place and it's part of their identity, like the loss is existential for them, and they really do feel it, and they feel a sense of grief. There was a paper I read recently about, it was more philosophical, about the phantom limb. So it's the idea that you lose a limb and, you have to get used to living without it, and you often feel it. So like the way things can change quite quickly because of tipping points and sort of cascading sort of processes, I suppose. and then it's gone, and then people have to learn how to deal with it. And then there's another angle, which is something that I want to pursue. Emily and myself were talking about the collapse of the mining industry in Northern England, and thought that it's quite an interesting example to compare, say, with central Queensland, which is very dependent on resources, so extractive industries and stuff. So there's a very risk that the transition away from fossil fuel intensive will lead to a loss of communities, and so we have to manage that transition. So these are different dimensions, right? And then for someone whose livelihood is dependent on fossil fuel or something, or even agriculture, right, with which is high emissions in Australia, like they're so tied up in what they do, it's part of them. That's why unsuccessful farms. So in the Cape York, I was talking to the NRM Cape York, and they're saying that barely any of the pastoral leases in Cape York actually make any money. And the only reason people stay there is because it's their families, they've been there forever and it's part of their identity. They love living it there. So, that's another, if you looked at it rationally, you'd be like, one of the NRM stakeholders said, if they wanted just some money, right, they would sell their land because the land's worth more than what they produce, and buy some units in Brisbane, and they'd make more money. But it's about connection to place. And then there's a whole another level with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what we're seeing in the Torres Strait is that, whole places are going underwater, burial sites. However, when I speak to mainland Aboriginal people, they always like, oh, everyone focuses on Torres Strait. What about us? Like, look at what's happening in our community. Look at what's happening around here. So there's a little bit of that as well, just to nuance that observation. So losses are being experienced, and how we deal with that, often not in rational ways. Otherwise, those farmers, after 6 years of drought or 10, well, it seems like drought is a normal condition. And just to end, a bit of a long-winded sort of spewing of consciousness that I gave you there, I just want to really reinforce, like, my understanding, at least, of the literature and the disasters, that climate change is actually being blamed for things that it's not causing. And there's a risk with framing things as climate change loss and damage. So a cyclone happens, or a flood event happens in Townsville, for example, in 2019. And for those few people that did attribute climate change to that, climate change caused it. Well, no, not so much. It's irresponsible land use. It's people building in very highly exposed and vulnerable places. Someone who says, oh, the drought is from climate change, that's what killed my crops. Potentially, but potentially it contributed to it. But actually the reason is that you're over extracting water. Look at the Murray-Darling system, the over extraction that's leading to, the fish deaths and things like that. Bushfires were caused by climate change. Oh, that takes the pressure off the government, right? Because climate change caused it. Well, living in the place in the middle of the bush caused your house to burn down, and climate change exacerbated that, right? So there's a risk with this climate change loss and damage language, where it actually takes the pressure off governments and people making decisions in their own life. And so that's something that I thought, that I'd be thinking about, and I will be writing on over the coming months, which is really underpins the critical way I look at climate change loss and damage. But to be fair, like, climate change is a significant risk in Australia, more so than some probably believe. Even those people that are like very aware of climate change, like, they're not quite aware enough of the severity and what will likely happen. Like, coastal settlements, not everywhere is going to be able to afford a massive seawall, right? Not everywhere is going to be able to afford infrastructural sort of adaptations to adapt to climate change into the future. So there is going to be a sort of a let it rip, to use a COVID term, where people will probably be turning to the state, and the state will probably be overwhelmed by the severity of, defending major cities in Australia, like, and big regional centers. Like, so Townsville, for example, is probably big enough to be, and has enough, sort of, the economy strong enough to sort of implement quite severe measures. Cairns to an extent, but it's geopolitically not that important. Darwin, Tracy knocked it down. It was rebuilt. It's a military outpost. So these are these political economic decisions about what is going to be protected, how we're going to adapt, and what is going to be left and what's going to be lost. And how we deal with that it's a moral question. It's a philosophical question. It's a scientific question, of course, but it's much more than that. That's about 40 minutes, and I could probably talk for more, but I'll leave it there. And please ask any questions though. And I hopefully that was useful for people.